Okay, so I have here today Dorie Clark, who is a marketing strategy consultant, a professional speaker, a contributor to Harvard Business Review, Time, Entrepreneur, various other places. She's been recognized as a branding expert by the Associated Press, Fortune, Inc. magazine. She's the author of 2 published books and 1 forthcoming book. Her first book was Reinventing You, Harvard Business Press, which has been translated into a number of languages. It was an excellent book. I have read that book and recommended it multiple times. Her most recent book is Stand Out, which was named the #1 leadership book of 2015 by Inc. magazine and was a Washington Post bestseller. And her new book, coming out in October 2017, so we can look forward to that, is called Entrepreneurial You, and that's with Harvard Business Review Press as well. So Dorie, thank you so much for speaking with me today about getting outside your comfort zone.
Thank you, Andy. Great to talk with you.
So I wanted to start by having you, think about a situation or a time in your professional life where you've had to step outside your comfort zone. Something that's challenging, was a stretch for you, was a reach for you, but somehow you were able to find the courage, find the skills, find the ability to overcome those challenges. I'd love you to tell our listeners that story, and then we can go from there.
Yeah, thank you. Well, one thing, of course, we were just chatting about before we hit the record button is that in the past year, something new that I have tried for myself is stand-up comedy, and of course, that's a little bit of a terrifying prospect for many people. For me, it was definitely a stretch because I spend a lot of my time on stages. I do professional speaking, but what I very quickly realized is that giving a business lecture on a stage is really different than doing stand-up comedy. The skills, I mean, certainly there's some transferable skills in terms of, being able to project and whatever, but you're not relying on slides. You don't have a podium. You're just up there with a microphone and you're dealing with a crowd that, let's be honest, if you're giving a business talk, it's sometimes a little bit of a low bar, right? They don't want to be bored. They want to learn something. But generally, they're going to be polite. But in a stand-up comedy audience, they have been drinking and they don't just want to, be pleasantly surprised. They want to be entertained to the point that they are laughing out loud. And if they don't, there is the possibility that they will heckle you. And so the stakes are just magnified to this extreme extent.
So let me ask you, how did you get interested in this? It's a very interesting hobby, I'm assuming? Not a second career? Is this a hobby?
We'll see how I do.
How did you get into it?
So there's a friend that I have in New York, a woman named Terry Trespicio, who also does business speaking, and she had started to do stand-up comedy, and she invited me to one of her shows, and I thought it sounded really fun. I thought it sounded like just a cool activity and one that I admired because I had done improv in college, but for 20 years I hadn't done anything related to the world of comedy. And one of my goals, the way that I sort of think about productivity and life and whatever, is that I like to set a small number, a fixed number of both personal and professional goals for myself. And so I think of it in 6-month increments. So every 6 months I set 2 professional goals and then 1 personal goal for myself. And I realized as I was thinking about what should my personal goal be, I thought, this would be a really great way to expand myself, to learn something fun, because when my book Stand Out launched in 2015, I worked so hard that year. I was constantly on the road speaking. I was doing 1 million podcasts. And toward the end of the year, I started to realize something kind of ominous, which is that people would ask sometimes that I met in a social situation. They'd be like, "So what do you do for fun?" And I literally did not have an answer because all I did was work. And I realized if someone's meeting me, if they're a business author or they like to read business books, they're probably going to think I'm super interesting. And if they don't, they're going to think I'm the most boring person in the world because that is all I can talk about. And I thought, no, I've got to expand and diversify. And so I set this personal goal. I thought, you know what, stand up sounds like a great thing to do. I'm going to push myself to do that. So I heard about it from Terry in the winter, but I was too busy then. But I literally put it on my calendar. I said, you know what, I'm going to have time in July. I'll do it this summer. And so I signed up for a course, and I took 2 courses, actually, one in the summer and one in the fall, and have performed probably about a dozen times. In fact, as we're speaking, tomorrow night I have another comedy show in New York, and I have 9 friends coming. So I'm trying to put myself out there.
So in terms of comfort zones, what was the biggest aspect of it that was a challenge for you in terms of stepping outside your comfort zone?
I think that what probably the biggest difference is that in the world of business speeches, you are rewarded for storytelling. That's considered a good thing. If you make a point and then you tell a good anecdote to back it up. And in stand up, the value system is different. And it sort of took me a while to figure that out, that they're literally looking for something different. They want you to condense it so much that it's not about telling a story. That's actually bad. What you need to do is boil the essence down to like 2 really funny sentences. And so I could feel the gears of my brain working. And it was an interesting process for me to realize that behavior that's rewarded in one context is actually not really correct in another one. You can't just map one onto the other. You have to understand what is called for in that context and adapt to that.
That's really interesting. When you were talking about improv before, I know people who have purposely taken improv classes, which has been outside their comfort zone because they felt awkward in social situations. And so they almost used improv as a tool to learn, social skills and how to carry on conversations, because so much of social life is improvisational, sort of like the yes and, like there's certain aspects of improv where you're meant to carry on a conversation even if it's a direction that you're not comfortable with, and there's a direct transfer. Was there any, this is very different, is there, and we'll get on to other comfort zone issues in a second, this is just very interesting, were there any other, I don't know, areas that you've maybe even been surprised about how doing stand-up has impacted you in other parts of your life?
Yeah, I think that one area that I think I appreciate it intellectually, but I didn't fully grasp until I started doing stand-up, was the importance of getting the audience on your side right away. Now, we all know that, let's say if you write a book, you want to start out strong, you want to grab them. We all like it if we read a novel and like something amazing happens in the first page, someone gets killed or, like, oh, who done it, that draws you in. And yet so often if I'm writing a book or if I'm writing a speech or, giving a speech or something like that, we start the way we see other people start, like, oh, hi, great to be here, so nice, thanks to Joe and Bob and Fran and Mary, and and it's just like the most insipid thing in the world, and we don't understand we're losing people when we do that. You need to get them on your side, and when in stand-up you have this automatic, like, immediate response. Like, you can tell if the audience is with you or if they're not with you, because they're either laughing or they're not laughing. You can see when they, their eyes start to dart around and they're looking at their phones or whatever. You have to keep their attention, and it's very fast paced. And so for me, in stand-up certainly, but also in transferable circumstances, I realized we can't simply be modeling the behavior of others around us sometimes for things like speeches or books or whatever, because most of what's out there, frankly, is mediocre. We need to never forget that the audience forms a first impression in the first 15 seconds, the first 30 seconds, and we need to take advantage of that, because what happens is if they form a good impression initially, they will root for you enough that they will be less hard on you later if something doesn't work. If the first thing doesn't work, the rest of your set could be amazing, but they'll just be crossing their arms like, yeah, whatever. If the first thing is funny and then a little bit later on something doesn't quite work, they'll give you the benefit of the doubt because they're in your world. And I
That's
think that's something
interesting.
that's really important.
Yeah, no, don't like, yeah, it's very interesting. Those first impressions really count. I was thinking as you were talking, various things went through my mind. Don't bury the headline, or first impressions count. I know when in academics that's even true. If you're writing a paper, you really want to capture the audience initially because they'll be critical later. But if they're more, it's almost like you're buying some insurance for yourself by getting them on your side. That's very interesting. Was there? Now, you mentioned you did this in the context of a class, and back to comfort zones. I know a lot of people talk about the idea that when you're stepping outside your comfort zone, whether it's public speaking or networking or small talk or being assertive, that you don't necessarily want to jump into the most terrifying version of the situation that you're talking about. So, in other words, I assume that you didn't go from zero to comedy club. Like there was some progression between there. Is that right? Is that what the class was?
That's what the class was. The class was really intended to be a kind of safe space, so to speak. So you had, an instructor who was a professional comedian, but a gentle one, nice one, and you would get up and do at first 2 minutes, pretty manageable, only 2 minutes. It's gonna be over before you know it, in front of the class, and the students know they're going to be doing their 2 minutes. So, I mean, no one is going to be a real jerk to you. Like they're going to,
Forgiving audience.
yeah, exactly. The teacher's going to give you feedback, but it's going to be, gentle feedback, not you sucked kind of feedback. And you do that for 6 weeks, and then you get yourself ready for a graduation show. So there definitely is a ramp up period where you can experiment and fail and be okay with that.
That's really interesting. So stepping away from stand up, which is a really fascinating topic, and I love the ways that it really can connect to other aspects of your life. What are some other examples for you, just personally or professionally, where you've had to step outside your comfort zone? I'd be curious. I think the audience would be interested in hearing about that. Is there something that sort of rings a bell for you?
Yeah, well, I have a comment, and then I have a question for you, Andy. Actually,
Sure.
so the comment, the response. I mean, something that's the first thing that really comes to my mind is I think back to when I was first starting out in the professional world, and I was younger than average, I guess you could say, because I had gone to college early. I actually started college when I was 14, and then I graduated when I was 18. And I went right into a master's program, which I finished when I was 20. So I was entering the workforce, at 20, which is a little younger than normal. But I would be going to these professional events, and everyone was older than me. It wasn't like I was 20 and this one is 23. It was like I was 20 and everyone was like 50, and it just felt so incredibly awkward, and I didn't know what to say to these folks. It was like, oh well, we're probably not going to be BFFs, because I'm 20 years old, and after this, they're going to go home to their 3 kids in the suburbs. So it was a very awkward thing for me. I did a lot of work in politics when I was younger. I was a campaign manager. I was a consultant on a number of races. I ultimately became a press secretary on a gubernatorial and then a presidential campaign. But a lot of times I would go to these like fundraisers, and I mean, the donors were all way older than me. And so learning how to make conversation and to try to build relationships with people who on the surface you just don't have anything in common with, that was intimidating for me. But I did force myself to do it, and I think I got reasonably good at it. And for me, the pathway really was I was, you were in the Boston area. I'm, and I'm in New York now, but for a long time I was living in Boston. So this was Massachusetts politics, which, despite our, sort of paltry presidential track record as of late, Massachusetts does breed a lot of national politicians. I mean, we think Mike Dukakis and John Kerry and Mitt Romney, all these people who maybe they weren't elected, but they were good enough and they rose to the top. Massachusetts is a good place to learn politics. They do it well there. And what I realized from watching very intently, I worked on dozens of campaigns, the best politicians, is that they treated the situation like they were always the host. Now, they
Hmm.
weren't, I mean, in some ways they are. I mean, I guess they were the headliner or whatever, but they didn't know these people. They didn't know all the random people that were coming to the thing, but they always, even if they didn't, they acted like the host. They made it their job to welcome other people. They'd always, oh, good to meet you. They do the half hug, half handshake, and the good ones, they were really genuine about it. But the attitude they had, because I think it's probably a little scary even for them to converse with all these random people, is they focused on welcoming the other people. And I think in doing that, it takes the pressure off of you to perform.
No, there's no question. I mean, it's adopting a role, right? It automatically gives you a script because when you're stuck in these situations where you're forced to make small talk with all these people, even as a famous person, it can be pretty intimidating. But if you're playing the welcoming host role, that gives you a script, right?
That's
It
exactly right.
Yeah, that's
Yeah. So,
interesting.
Yeah, so the question that I have for you, Andy, that I'd just be curious about your feedback on is how do you tell the difference between a situation that is outside your comfort zone that you need to surmount and it's important for you to do, as compared to a situation that's outside your comfort zone and it's just you freaking hate it and like you don't really want to do it. It would just be forcing yourself to do it,
Right.
and maybe you're better off like avoiding it.
Right. No, it's a really good question. And because we also will create, if I understand the question correctly, that we'll often create rationalizations, where it might be something that we would want. It can be confusing. Like we can tell ourselves that, oh, this is outside my comfort zone. I don't want to do it. It's not worth it, for instance. But actually, it might really be worth it. But you use that as a rationalization not to do it. Um, you know, so one question that I teach a class at Brandeis where I think I might have told you about this, where I have usually 25 or 30 MBA students, so young adults, young professionals who have to step outside their comfort zones, and I watch them. It's almost like a living laboratory, and I get some awesome insight into the challenges of acting outside your comfort zone. And one question that I always ask people or encourage them to ask themselves is, if I didn't experience any anxiety, just as a thought exercise, if I didn't experience any anxiety in this situation, if I could snap my fingers and have it go away as a thought exercise, would this be something I'd be excited to do or be able to do? Right? If you could just have that anxiety disappear, is this something that's really cool that I'd really love to be able to do in my heart of hearts? And it's a little hard. It's a thought exercise. Of course, we're talking about some alternative reality that doesn't exist, but oftentimes that exercise enables people to be able to say, yeah, I would love to be able to speak in
Yeah.
public. Yes, of course, I make all these excuses and I say I can't do it because I don't have the time or I have to be with my kids or whatever. But you know what? If I could take the anxiety away, I'd love to be able to do that. Or they might say, you know what? No matter what, if my pulse rate was 50 or something, I mean, if it was like the most like non-anxiety provoking situation in the world, I just have no interest. Do you
Yeah.
know what I mean? And I don't know. That's a question that I often find, but I do find that it's sometimes hard to answer that question because sort of anxiety and rationalizations and fear sometimes clouds the picture. I don't know.
Yeah.
What do you think?
I think that's a really good litmus test, because one thing, when I think about stepping outside your comfort zone, one thing that I talk about, and in fact I even advise others, so it's good to just always ask, reality check, like, oh, am I just enabling people?
Yeah.
But for instance, I'm an introvert, and there are certain types of networking events that I super hate. So, for instance, if it's going to be like a really big, loud cocktail party where I don't know a lot of people, like you walk into a room and it's like hundreds of people, and it's like, who do I talk to? Like, this is very uncomfortable for me. And so I've just decided, like, a couple of years ago, I just decided, what? I hate this. I'm not going to do it. I'm not ever going to do it. I will network with people in lots of other ways, but I don't like this. And so I swore off of it. But it's you want to interrogate yourself sometimes, like, oh, am I just justifying it, or or is it actually like, a good legitimate choice? Now, I think with your frame, I would lean toward saying it's a legitimate choice, because the thing that it reminds me of, which I also hate, is like partying at nightclubs
Yeah.
because it's loud and lots of people drinking and stuff, and I don't like that either. But I don't know. What do you think?
Well, no, I think that's right. And as I talk about in my book, I think if you can start to see yourself as sort of powerful instead of powerless in these situations, you end up realizing you have a lot of capacity to sculpt your life and to sculpt situations to your liking. So for instance, if the goal in this situation in your case is to, depends what it is, whether it's to, to, I don't know, meet people and create business contacts or whatever the goal might be, right? There are multiple ways to achieve that goal. Maybe the conventional way or the standard way or the default way for some people are these massive networking events, which by the way I also feel like deeply uncomfortable in. There are multiple solutions to that. You've written about this yourself. I've learned a lot from your writing in this topic, but for instance, you can not go to them. You can decide that you're going to find other different types of networking events. You can decide that you're a morning person and you want to go to smaller, more intimate networking events. In the academic world, I've found that to be the case as well. They're massive conferences. We have one yearly that has 10,000 people. And I often, not in the same room, but I often opt for the smaller, more intimate conferences like at a farmhouse, like 40 people at a farmhouse, which is so much better. I like that so much more. But you can also sometimes, sort of customize or tweak an event itself. So if it is a massive networking event, you can bring a friend, or you can give yourself a goal. I'm talking to two people, try to make maybe two connections at most. And you know what? If they're good connections, I'll then maybe meet that person for coffee or something like that in a more comfortable situation. Or you might decide that, I do this myself, that I'm going to get there really early because, yeah, there's going to be 1,000 people, but there won't be 1,000 people at the beginning. Right?
Right.
And so you
Yep.
then can sort of almost sculpt a situation. You can downsize a situation by playing with time a little bit. So I know there are a lot of things you can do, but I don't think it's a cop out at all. In fact, I think it's a mistake to sort of see life through the dichotomous lens of, failure, success, or go to the event or don't go to the event. I think there's a lot of middle ground in terms of ways to sort of achieve your purposes in slightly different ways. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's great.
So, so any other advice to our listeners about stepping outside your comfort zone? Anything that you'd like to pass on in terms of your own life, whether it's stand up, whether it's entering the work world as such a young, precocious person? Any other advice that you have?
Well, one of the things that I think is most useful actually comes from your work, Andy. But I really liked how one of the things that you talk about is having a kind of like cultural mentor, because
Mm,
I think that's really helpful, because if we don't know how to be, we're kind of like taking just a shot in the dark. And oftentimes, because you have a caricature in your head, you will over index in the opposite direction. So like, oh, I'm scared to promote myself, but I know I have to promote myself. And then like you promote yourself so much you look like a jerk because you
right.
like just, okay, that's what I have to do. And you don't get the proportions right. But if you have a role model that you can sort of latch onto, someone, I mean, it doesn't even have to be a real person in your life. It could be, some kind of external role model, like a historical figure or a celebrity or something like that. But as long as you're sort of immersing and watching carefully, I mean, it's even better, of course, if it's someone in your life. But if you can find a way to calibrate yourself based on the model of someone that you think is doing a good job, it gives you a lot more data to operate off of, so you don't feel like you're guessing so blindly.
And also, I'd add from what you said earlier, I think that the structure of a class, it doesn't have to be a traditional class, but a class where you've got a relatively safe space, but someone who's kind of pushing you and inching you slightly outside your comfort zone, as you talked about your teacher did, in a context with an audience, so that there is a bit of stress, but not a ridiculously large or intense or critical audience. You know what I mean? And so to build it through stages, I would argue that there's probably a lot of, it's not a mentor, but a lot of mentoring in that context that you talked about, I'm guessing.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, all right, this has been great. I love talking with you, and I really appreciate it, and I'm sure that our listeners will as well. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Andy.